Okay. Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome you all to our 17th roundtable and our 70th event since 2022. Today we are hosting Professor Zhang Rongkun from the University of Shanghai for Science and Technology, Professor Jenny Hung from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and Professor Christine Tan from the National University of Singapore. These three scholars will discuss fate, desires, and transformations in the Zhuangzi. Our chair today is Emily Kossak from East China Normal University. It's become a tradition here at Shanghai Weishui to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience today who wish to be part of a future event, please email me. This event today will be 2 hours total, ending promptly at 11 a.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Emily, I just want to say a few words about the四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive, sometimes conventional practices found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes sometimes found in so-called blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家at the forefront of all of our events. The Shanghai Weishui Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people can truly learn from and with one another. So, before introducing our chair, I just want to once again thank everyone in the audience and most especially our three speakers. Thank you all very much for participating in this event today. Our chair is Emily Kossak. She is an MA student in the Chinese philosophy program at East China Normal University. Her She's interested in intellectual and conceptual history, particularly the introduction of liberalism to China in the late Qing period. Thank you for hosting today, Emily. The screen is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Professor D'Ambrosio, for giving me the chance to chair this roundtable. I'm very honored to take part in this discussion with the scholars, and I would say without further ado, let's get into it. I will first introduce all of our speakers, and then the first speaker, Professor Zhang Rongkun, will start with the presentation of her topic. So Zhang Rongkun is an associate professor at the University of Shanghai for Science and Technology. She received her master's degree from Fudan University and her doctoral degree from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She has been a visiting scholar at Stanford University, the University of Copenhagen, National Taiwan University, and National Chengchi University. And is a member of ISCP, APA, and ACPA. She has published a number of works in both English and Chinese, including Tao, a journal of comparative philosophy, Philosophy East and West, Religions, and Suzhou Journal of Philosophical Studies. She also serves as a reviewer for several academic journals. Her research interests primarily focus on Chinese philosophy, especially Taoism. Jenny Hung is an assistant professor in the Division of Humanities at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She has 2 PhDs, one in philosophy, another one in nanophysics. She investigates the nature of the self from both the Western and Eastern perspectives. She published in Syntheses, Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Mind, Philosophical Psychology, Philosophy East and West, Tao, a Journal of Comparative Philosophy, Asian Philosophy, History of Philosophy and Logic, and so on. She is now working on 2 books, Between Buddha Nature and Emptiness, The Peak Era of Chinese Buddhism, and What Am I? The Self and Oneness in Chinese Philosophy. Christine Tan is a lecturer at the National University of Singapore. She is a Filipino-born philosopher who works on Chinese and decolonial philosophy. Her monograph, Freedom's Frailty, Self-Realization in the Neo-Taoist Philosophy of Guoxiang's Zhuangzi, draws on Guo to reconstruct an account of freedom and as decadence. She writes on issues of selfhood, agency, and meaning. She's a member of Women Doing Philosophy and an advisory board member for the Institute of Global Value Inquiry. So let's welcome Professor Zhang to give her talk. Professor Zhang, you have like roughly 10 minutes to present your topic.
Okay, thank you very much for your very generous introduction. And it's my honor to do this presentation. The topic of my presentation is revisiting the concept of fate and heaven in Zhuangzi's philosophy. The reason for me to do this presentation is that there are some conventional explanations of Zhuangzi's direct attributions of misfortune to fate, but I want to interpret it through the lens of the unity of heaven and humanity mode of thinking. We all know that there's an allegory where Shen Tujia is a person who has been punished for crime. Under normal circumstances, most people would view his situation of suffering punishment like losing a foot as unfair. It is difficult for people to naturally accept their circumstances as their fate, and instead they often try to rationalize their mistakes. This reflects the common state in which individuals are dominated by the small self, a state marked by the division between heaven and humanity. But Zhuangzi, in a very striking departure from conventional thinking, argue that, I will quote one of his sentences in the Zhuangzi, if you play around near Archer E's target, lurking near the bullet's eye, it is only normal to get hit. If you manage to escape being hit, that is just fate, random good luck. Here, Zhuangzi even exaggerates by stating that living in this world is like playing around near Archer E's target, where making mistakes is normal. And he goes on to say that those who manage to escape being hit, those who make no mistakes, are exceptionally fortunate individuals, favored by fate and blessed with good luck. There's a potential misunderstanding here. One might suspect that Zhuangzi advocates avoiding self-reflection and directly shifting responsibility onto fate. Furthermore, as the allegory shows, he even goes so far as to normalize moral feelings. In fact, this is not the true intent of Zhuangzi as a Taoist sage. Rather, he promotes the ability to maintain a mindset of unity between heaven and humanity, which involves wholly entrusting one's body and mind to heaven like an infant, inner, even while remaining in the human world. They no longer see themselves as isolated subjects, remorsefully reflecting on their actions for the misfortunes and human plague, nor as those who try to defend or rationalize their mistakes. It is precisely for this reason that the genuine human described by Zhuangzi, 真人, could be mistaken without feeling any regret, for their spiritual state is firmly anchored in heaven. In other words, they dwell within this higher force, attaining a state of peace and ease. This also explains why only a true virtuous person can understand what is unavoidable and find peace in it as his own fate. Thus, very interestingly, unlike Confucianism or Laozi, Zhuangzi does not place particular emphasis on introspection. At the same time, we can also say that Zhuangzi's concept of virtuosity is a dynamic cultivation process of continuously adjusting one's thinking from a separation between heaven and humanity to a unity of heaven and humanity. The separation between heaven and humanity is a habitual state of human beings, and it is only by continuously allowing heaven to infuse one's life and becoming a heaven-intoxicated person that one can cultivate to become a Zhuangzi sage. So he says, virtuosity really just means the practice of forming new harmonies. In this sense, virtuosity is better understood as an ongoing process of forming new harmonies rather than a fixed state of cultivated perfection. That is, it refers to the practice of creating harmony, not to harmonies themselves. So the absence of self-reflection is not a sign of passivity, but rather the embodiment of an alternative mode of thinking, that is the pursuit of a fundamental unity of heaven and humanity, whereby one continuously maintains a state of oneness with heaven in the human world. In such a state, on the one hand, one can act with the ultimate appropriateness and naturalness, and on the other hand, when confronted with misfortune, one no longer engage in self-blaming reflection or self-justification, because one's life is always inseparable from heaven. Concerns over benefit and harm, fortune and misfortune no longer lies at the center of one's awareness. Instead, one is settled within the inscrutable forces wiser than ourselves, as A.C. Graham described it. In this context, the tendency of Zhuangzi's protagonist to attribute misfortune to fate, and Zhuangzi's elevation of such acceptance to the level of completely realized virtuosity can be fully understood. So I just want to bring this new perspective of unity between humanity and heaven to explain the concept of fate and heaven in Zhuangzi's philosophy. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Professor Zhang, thank you for your presentation. And now I would ask Professor Jenny Hong to provide comments and questions. Professor Hong, you have roughly 7 minutes.
Yeah, thank you for Professor Zhang's very interesting presentation. And I have understood more about your ideas of the relationship between heaven and humanity, Zhuangzi's different levels of spiritual state, and how moral feelings are normalized. So I have several questions regarding your presentation, and I would like you to shed light on more on the ideas. So when you talk about virtue cultivation, what do you think about Zhuangzi's criteria of virtue? So what belongs to the realm of virtue? Could you give us some examples of, for example, what kind of behaviors or what kind of intention so is included in the realm of virtues according to Zhuangzi? So insofar as I know, my study of Zhuangzi is that his idea of virtue may be very different from the Confucian tradition, because the Confucian is like talking about the interactions between human beings and other beings in society, while for Zhuangzi, I guess maybe you would like to say that the idea of virtue not only contains the interaction between human beings in society, but also something more. So could you please let us know more about how Zhuangzi defines virtue and how and whether there are some examples of the exhibition of virtue in Zhuangzi's writings?
Okay, thank you very much for Jenny's question. Yeah, the virtue is very different from the virtue in the Confucian sense. So Professor Brock's the poem translated virtue as virtuosity. So, with respect to the meaning or connotation of the virtue in Zhuangzi's sense, I think the key point is that the virtue should be aligned with the virtue of heaven. So what does the virtue of heaven mean? I think we can summarize as emptiness and stillness, which in Chinese term 虚 and 静. 虚 and 静 is a virtue of the heaven. So we have to align ourselves of the virtue of ourselves with this emptiness and stillness. And that is also the fasting of the heart advocate. Xinzhai fasting of the heart advocate to cultivate. So that is a virtue that we should cultivate in order to align with the virtue of the heaven. And I think that is what Zhuangzi means by the so-called virtue or virtuosity. Regarding some examples, I can give you some phrases like 虚无恬淡，奈何天得。And so on. And 道德之平而天地之平而道德之治也。天地之平而道德之治也。Which also indicates that emptiness and stillness is also the virtue of heaven or the way of heaven. And that is also, I think, the very obvious sign that that we should maintain the model thinking that the unity of humanity and heaven that is very consistent in Zhuangzi's philosophy. Thank you very much for your question, and I hope it is helpful.
Thank you so much for Professor Zhang's inspiring answer to this question. Yes, I do observe that there are huge differences between Zhuangzi's idea of virtue and the Confucian idea of virtue, which is emphasizing on very different things, right? You have just mentioned emptiness and stillness and fasting the mind as some prominent examples of virtue in the Zhuangzi. And these are not really mentioned in the Confucian traditions. I mean, they're not emphasized, at least.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah,
like,
exactly.
yeah. So Zhuangzi is like more talking about your own spiritual state, how to maintain emptiness, how to maintain stillness within your mind. While
Yeah.
the Confucian tradition is more like talking about the interactions, how you should behave. For example, in a particular situation, or what kind of
What
moral
is appropriate?
emotions, you should have in a particular context. So I
Yeah,
feel like they're so different. So, and I have another question, which is about the self. So you talk about the self as inseparable from heaven in the Zhuangzi.
mm,
So I would like to know more about what you think about the nature of the self in the context of the Zhuangzi. So is it a kind of what is the self? What is it referring to in the context of the Zhuangzi? What do you
um,
think?
with respect to the nature of self, I think in according to Professor Xu Fuguan in the book《中国人性论史先秦篇》, he thinks that there's no solid nature. Um, uh, uh, I mean, the human nature is not a very solid and concrete thing, and there's no definitions. It's always fluid and flexible. It is not like the Confucianists say that there's a goodness in human nature. There's nothing even. So I think with respect to the human nature in Xu Fuguan's view, there's no fixated human nature there. That is Professor Xu Fuguan's perspective. And for me, I think with respect to the nature of the self, um, probably there's no obvious narrative in Zhuangzi's philosophy, but I think he just wants to elevate the the spiritual level to to a spiritual sphere where we can align ourselves with the virtual heaven. So we just need to cultivate the virtue within us, or cultivate the nature of ourselves in order to align with the nature of heaven. So I think that is what Xu Fuguan thinks, and um, also I present my own point of view.
I see. Thank you so much for your answer to the question about the self. I'm very happy to hear about Xu Fuguan's view, and that according to which there is no solid nature, no fixed idea of human nature, and therefore there's no definition of the self, which I think is quite correct, or a very good interpretation of the Zhuangzi's idea of the self. So thank you so much for answering my questions. I don't have more questions. So would Emily like to proceed? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny.
Um, Professor Hung, thank you for your discussion. And now I would ask Christine Tan to provide us with her discussion. Christine Tan, you also have roughly 7 minutes.
Right. Thank you, Rongkun. So I really like your discussion, and I really like how you frame the Zheren as having not much introspection and self-reflection, because like in Anglo-European philosophy, right, that's almost automatically a bad thing, that if you don't self-reflect. But here, if you really think about it, right, there's no fixed self. So what really is there that's reflecting? And if you think even more about it, that actually is what allows what you say, creating harmony and sorry about that, fundamental unity. So my question is in relation to that. So you say that there's creating, so the virtuosity is about creating harmony, but also finding or aligning with fundamental unity. So I'm curious about the different framing of creating harmony and also uh, fundamental harmony, which sounds to me more like an ontological given. Is that what you meant? That like fundamental unity, as there's this foundational unity that of heaven, earth, and man, or something like that, and then we have to align with that.
Fundamental unity?
Yeah. Could you elaborate more on what you meant by the fundamental unity?
Uh, did I mention fundamental unity?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So you don't mean the foundational unity. So I guess I can just reframe it as
I
okay.
think the fundamental unity can be interpreted in the way that when someone becomes a heaven intoxicated person after cultivation, yeah, you just your spiritual spheres may be aligned or unified with the heaven and earth or the spiritual heaven and earth. And I think that is a fundamental unity means. That is fundamentally based on the self-cultivation. If you do not do the self-cultivation, so this fundamental unity cannot be achieved. As long as you just cultivate yourself and becomes a heaven intoxicated person after cultivation, I think the fundamental unity or the fundamental harmony can be created.
But that is an ongoing process, like you said as well, right?
Yeah, because the self-cultivation is an ongoing process.
Okay, yeah, all right. Yeah, that's really all my question. I think Jenny's questions also covered my earlier questions as well.
Thank
So
you very
that
much.
is it about for me.
Thank you very much for your question. And
Thank you,
I
Rongkun.
really appreciate.
Okay, Professor Zhang, thank you so much for your presentation. And
Thanks.
now we can
Thank
move
you.
on.
Thank you. It's my honor. Thank you.
So now we can move on to the next speaker. Let's welcome Professor Hong to our discussion. Professor Hong, you have roughly 10 minutes to present.
Can I share my screen? Can I share my screen?
Yeah, you
I
can.
have made some
Yeah.
slides.
Yeah, it should work, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, it's you.
Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about Zhuangzi's idea of desires and how to transform our desires. And this would be a comparison between Zhuangzi and Harry Frankfurt, a contemporary analytic philosopher who works on desires. So I will briefly talk about Harry Frankfurt's framework of desires. So he has devised two levels of desires. The first is the first order desires, which refers to the desires to do something. For example, I wish to go to Ocean Park today. This is my first order desire. And he also thinks that there are second order desires, which are desires for a first order desire. For example, if I say, I wish that I will have a desire to go to Ocean Park, then this is a second order desire. So why am I talking about this? It is because he has the idea of wantons, which is related to Zhuangzi's discussion of desires. So wantons are beings that do not have second order volitions. So second-order volition is one kind of second-order desires that is the definition. A person has a second-order volition even only if he wants a certain desire to be his will. For example, I want to have certain sets of desires. For example, I want to become a person who likes studies, who likes to study. I want to be a scholar. That is a second-order volition, and I want this desire to be my will. So this is my representing desire. And then, according to Frankfurt, there are persons that do not have second-order volitions. They don't plan what kind of person they want to be. So these kind of persons can be regarded as wantons. So he gives an example. He says a drug addict who is indifferent to and has no second-order volitions about his first-order desires. So he's just following all the instances. He hasn't planned. He hasn't controlled his first-order desires. And these people are wantons. So this idea is adopted by David Bellman to describe Zhuangzi's spiritual state. Bellman thinks that Zhuangzi actually recommends us to be higher level wantons because when he describes these Taoist sages, they are so free, right? They are so spontaneous, so they don't control their desires. They are just reacting to the stimulus without thinking about what to do. So the problem with this kind of description of the Zhuangzi is the dangerous sage. Think about a situation where a higher Taoist sage is going to rob the bank. So he has an instinct. He wants to rob the bank. But he's spontaneous because he doesn't have a control over his first-order desires. So what should a sage do if he has a dangerous desire to hurt people, to rob the bank, to kill somebody? So this is the question. And I have written a paper to propose the following. I think, no. A Taoist sage is not a wanton. Instead, she's an observer. So how to solve the problem of the dangerous sage? I would like to propose that actually a Taoist sage does not need second-order volitions to control the first-order desires because their first-order desires are in accordance with nature. So this is my framework. So I will give some examples to illustrate my framework. First of all, there are descriptions in the Zhuangzi about observations. So I read a little bit of them. For example, hold on to all that you have received them from heaven. The perfect man uses his mind like a mirror. The mind stops recognition. And if you are content with the time and willing to follow along, so all these descriptions seems to refer to the mind as a mirror. So I would say, actually, Zhuangzi is describing a kind of observation. And also, if you are observing your emotions, your mental state, there is no judgments. So according to the Zhuangzi, the sage does not proceed in such a way, following along with things the way they are, and make no room for personal views. To serve your mind so that sadness or joy do not sway or move it. So these are indications that a Taoist sage does not produce emotions from judgments. So this is my thought. When one observes, one's desires become the observational target. And an observation is a second-order mental action, but it is not the kind of volition, according to Frankfurt. So an observer detects the flow and gives no judgment to the mental state he just has. So here is my argument. By definition, a wanton does not care about the first-order desires. But an observer cares about his desires in a special way, namely observing the first-order desires according to the Zhuangzi. Therefore, My conclusion is that an observer is not a wanton. Zhuangzi's idea of an observer is not to recommend us to be wantons. So the differences between a wanton and observer is that a wanton is like someone who loses interest in checking his arithmetic and he doesn't check it. But an observer is like someone who checks his arithmetic again but has no attempt to modify any sums. So he just observes. He's very careful. He cares about the arithmetic, but he doesn't change the sum. So how much time do I have, or it should be the end of it?
You still have time. Yeah, you have like 3 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so I would just say one more point. So why am I observing our emotions or mental state? What is the use of it? According to Zhuangzi, actually observation helps transform our first order desires. So that if you become a higher Taoist sage, your first order desires are in accordance with nature. So here are some textual evidence. You can see from the description in the Zhuangzi, a Taoist sage, namely a true man, has very different set of first order desires. For example, a true man did not rebel against want, did not grow proud in plenty, and did not plan his affairs. And if he committed an error, he does not regret it, and he does not make a show. He knew nothing of loving life and knew nothing of hating death. So you can see a Taoist sage, a true man, has a very different configuration of first order desires compared with that of the ordinary persons. So I think observation helps us transform our desires such that our first order desires eventually are changed to be in accordance with nature. For example, it says in the Zhuangzi, deep in their passions and desires, they are shallow in the workings of heaven. So there is a difference between the desires of a sage and that of an ordinary person. So these are some other textual evidence. Therefore, here is my summary. I have proposed that when a person becomes an observer, his first order desires gradually change. And if he becomes a Taoist sage, his first order desires are in accordance with nature. And in this stage, he doesn't need to deploy second order volitions to control his first order desires. So this is my presentation about Zhuangzi's idea of desires. Thank you so much.
Professor Hong, thank you for your presentation. And now I would ask Professor Zhang to provide comments and questions. Professor Zhang, you have roughly 7 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much. I think I really appreciate Professor Jenny's presentation because I really agree with his viewpoint on Zhuangzi. She think that Zhuangzi is a observer and Zhuangzi cares about the first desires. Cares about the first desire, which is very different from the ordinary people. That is just in accordance with the nature, and he doesn't care about the failures and the success and the external affairs and so on. So I also remember that Zhuangzi mentions the theories of wu qing, no emotions, literally rendered as wu qing. So I wonder what is the relationship between the desire and wu qing? So how can you accommodate these two concepts, and how would you interpret the essence of wu qing, and how does it relate to your concept of the desire? Thank you.
Thank you so much for Professor Zhang's intriguing question about the definition of qing in the context of the Zhuangzi. So, in my opinion, I think when Zhuangzi says we do not have qing, we are wuqing, I think he's not referring to emotions, but instead he is talking about the nature of human beings. Just as what you have mentioned, I think there is no fixed nature of human beings because we can transform ourselves. For example, when I am an ordinary person, I have a very kind of self-oriented set of first-order desires. For example, I like fame. I like to pursue wealth, and I like to become, a recognized person. So all these are my first-order desires as an ordinary person. But when I practice observation, I transform myself. And now I become a Taoist stage of higher spiritual level, and my first order desire to become famous fade out. So I don't have a fixed nature. I don't have a fixed characteristic of a configuration of desires. Instead, my qing, so this is how I read Zhuangzi, my qing actually is not fixed, but instead it is transformable. It is plastic. So if I practice observation, I can become a Taoist stage, and I can go along with the flow. I can react with environment in a spontaneous way because I now am aligned with nature more than when I was an ordinary person. So this is my understanding of wuqing, which means that I don't have a fixed nature as a human being. So I understand that some other scholars may interpret the idea of qing as emotions, but I'm not very satisfied with this kind of interpretation because I think Zhuangzi actually prefers to describe sages, even those Zhenren, those true persons, as having certain kind of emotions. For example, they will be happy when they go to look at the sunset, which is beautiful. It is not a kind of attachment. It is not a kind of artificial judgment of anything, but it is a spontaneous response to the beauty of the sunset, which I think Zhuangzi would appreciate. So I don't think Zhuangzi would like to say that as a true person, we do not have any emotions. I think it is a kind of misinterpretation of the Zhuangzi. But of course, this is controversial. So we can discuss more about how to understand Wuqing. And this is very interesting. Thank you so much for Professor Zhang's question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor Zhang, do you have any other questions?
Other questions? Um,
no problem if not, then I would.
Okay. I also wondered, when you mentioned in accordance with nature, I think in a lot of cases we live in a modern world, in the human world, and we have to tackle with a lot of complicated human relationships, and that when you refers to in accordance with nature, I think when it comes to the human world, where there are so many complicated human relationships, how would you interpret the so-called in accordance with nature? Because in a very broad sense, we can understand very well the meaning of in accordance with nature, and just don't let our desires dominate our life like the ordinary people. But we but after all, we live in a very complicated human world, and what do you mean by in accordance with nature when it comes to the human world? Because in chapter 人间世, Zhuangzi elaborate on some specific issues and scenarios in the human world, and how does the in accordance with nature demonstrate, in your opinion?
So, Zhang, for your wonderful question. It is actually a very difficult question to answer, and I think Zhuangzi provides different answers in different scenarios about how to live with this chaotic society. So he provides different advices in different situations. For example, when he talks about how to deal with the complexities in life as a person who is always within society, which is like being thrown into a particular situation. There is the 叶公子高. 叶公子高 is he's kind of a consulate representing his state to talk with Qi. So he encounters a very difficult situation because he has to, he has the responsibility to represent his own state, and he has to go to negotiate with another state. So he's in high pressure. So Zhuangzi's advice in this particular harsh situation is to 安之若命. So 安之若命 is like saying that, okay, you have to accept some fate. You have. So Professor Zhang has just mentioned the idea of fate in this situation. So you are thrown into the world and have to face a particular harsh situation. There is your fate. And how to deal with this very difficult situation is to accept it as your very unfortunate fate, and to just, react like a mirror, not to have any personal attachment or, judgments from a narrow personal perspective, but instead learn to have a broader sense of what is happening in this situation and react appropriately. So this is one advice Zhuangzi suggests to a person who is dealing with a complicated social situation, but there are other advices in other situations. So in general, we can look at 庖丁解牛. There is the butcher Ding, who is having very high skills of killing an ox, or killing something. So his advice is to find a gap between the bones, and to live a satisfactory life without being hurt by society. And I think actually this is also an advice which is very much related to the idea of being in accordance with nature. So the nature of an ox is such that there are bones, which are the parts you shouldn't touch, and there are soft parts such as the gaps between the bones, which are parts you can negotiate and you can go through. So if you are a Taoist sage, you are practicing, a high spirituality as an observer, and your emotions and desires would be in accordance with nature, such that you won't touch the bones, which are those, hard parts in society. And you can go through those gaps, which are the space between the bones, such that you won't be hurt. So I think in general, Zhuangzi's answer would be similar to an answer provided by Paulin. But of course, in different scenarios, Zhuangzi would say different things to provide specific advice to the person. So this is how I understand Zhuangzi. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the human world, maybe we encounter the complicated issues and the person, like in 人间世, Zhuangzi tries to persuade the evil ruler to be good, and that is that becomes more complicated. And on the one hand, we have to behave in accordance with the nature of the ruler, but on the other hand, we might be we should hold the principle of value. So I think that is also something that we should stick to, like the principle of value. Otherwise, how should we persuade someone to behave good, behave himself and do the good things and to be a benevolent person? So I think might be something that we should hold, like the principle. Seemingly it is the Confucian thing, but I think that is also Zhuangzi stick to. And so on the one hand, I think he advocate in accordance, do something in accordance with nature, but there's also some principle value we should hold in the human world. Otherwise, maybe we will 随波逐流 or something like that. Okay, I
I
just
see.
want to
Yeah.
give a
Yeah. Your ideas are very interesting, and I also agree with you that actually Zhuangzi is not like a relativist in ethics. He
yeah,
has some preferences on what is preferred and what is not preferred and in
yeah.
particular when we talk about ethical judgments and ethical behaviors.
Mm.
However, I would prefer to say that Zhuangzi put these ideas within the idea of being in accordance with nature.
Oh,
So I would merge the two together, saying that if you are a higher stage of spontaneity, actually all your behaviors would be so-called morally benevolent or morally genuine, such that you won't hurt others. So I would say these two things do not contradict each other. Instead, being in accordance with nature actually enhance your morality because you're spontaneous. You don't think,
yes.
you don't calculate the benefits you would have after doing this kind of action. So it is
Yeah.
genuine ethical.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is like
yeah,
a very natural expression of care or other things.
yeah.
So
That makes
yeah,
a lot of
in
sense.
my opinion, Zhuangzi is proposing a kind of natural moral reaction by these sages. So these two things, like morality and spirituality, actually merge together.
Yeah,
That's
I
what
agree.
my thought. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. Thank you very much. Really
Yeah. Thank you
appreciate.
so much for raising this.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhang, for your discussion.
Thank
And
you.
now I would ask Christine Tan to provide us with her comments and questions. Christine Tan, you also have like 7 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, for that really interesting presentation. I was wondering what you thought about, because on one side, right, there are criticisms about Zhuangzi being a wanton, that Ziran is just do whatever you want. But then on the other side, there's also criticisms about Zhuangzi being a withdrawn mystic and like recluse. I wonder if you think that the observer is something like that, or the observer sage is actually someone who would not be okay living in reclusion, being withdrawn, and all these other things that um, critics of Wu Dai would say he is.
Thank you so much for your intriguing question. I think it is an open question that does not have a definitive answer. And that's why there's so many scholars discussing and debating on whether Zhuangzi actually recommends us to be hermits living in an isolated mountain, not really interacting with others. And also, actually, in the religious Taoist tradition, there is a recommendation of being a hermit and practicing, Neidan and meditation and taking in some alchemy, taking in some kind of drugs, etc. So I think there are some reasons to regard Zhuangzi's idea as a recluse or as a hermit. So there are reasons indeed. But I do think there are different plausible explanations and interpretations of the Zhuangzi that also has a lot of wise advices to us as citizens and as people who are constantly interacting within the world, within society. So I would say Zhuangzi is like opening the choice. It is up to you whether you want to be a hermit or not. He would not say being a hermit is morally wrong. He would not say we should always become a citizen within society. But I think it is more like opening to you for your choice to choose which is more suitable for your own personality. So it is like everybody has his own personality. And if you are really that kind of person who prefers to live in a mountain, go for it. But if you are not that kind of person, also go for it. Just stay in this very chaotic society and learn to be an observer and learn to deal with complicated situations. If that is your fate, because personality is actually part of your fate. So I'm born with a particular personality. I have to face this situation. I have my own family. I already established a social status. It is very difficult to withdraw from it. So this is kind of my fate. So I have to face it, accept it, and deal with it. So I think Zhuangzi has no fixed answer as to what kind of living style we should pursue. Instead, it is more like what kind of fate I have, I'm going to deal with it. So that is what I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I really like this answer. Usually I hear one way or the other that one should be a recluse or no, he wouldn't. I think that it is more consistent for in his philosophy for you to not choose to be a recluse because then I feel like that's valuing U more than Ziran. But
Hmm?
I really like your answer as well, that it's like very open and it depends on your situation. I think that makes sense as well. Thank you. I think that's all for me.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Professor Hung, thank you so much for your presentation. And now we can move on to the last speaker. Let's welcome Christine Tan to our discussion. Christine, you have roughly 10 minutes to present your topic.
So let me just share my screen. So this is based on a paper that I published in Philosophy and Social Criticism. So if you'd like a longer version of this, the title of the paper is Can Inequality Ever Be Justified? So this is part of that. And the two passages that I would like to focus on today are the Piping of Heaven story in chapter 2 and another in chapter 17 on the times as in Shi and Ning. So the passages I think are often read as passages on equanimity. That is, to simply ask us to psychologically accept what we cannot control, release our attachment and finicky desires to specific or expected outcomes, and ultimately to try to find peace in what is given. However, I think that this misses the point because the equanimity reading reads it as a kind of self-help, like what can the text do for me? But in my reading, I read it as a philosophical text. So what is it philosophically telling us? And I think that the text is actually doing something or actually making a more unsettling philosophical move. And I think that these passages are primarily not necessarily how we should feel psychologically about fate, but about the roles that fate and Shi have in such a way that they undermine the possibility of stable estimation and valuation, which, if we will remember at the time, was foundational to the Confucian philosophy that he was reacting to. So it is, as I will show, about the philosophical implausibility of assigning worth to persons or xian to persons and action. So this is the piping of heaven passage. And here, basically, Sir Shoestrap of South Wall describes the wind as gusting through 10,000 hollows in a mountain forest, each producing its own sound. And the question that follows in this passage is, what is the rouser behind all of this? What causes the 10,000 differences? And the answer here is that there is none. So all things come only from themselves, and Sir Shoestrap further elaborates that even if there was something in control, it is peculiarly devoid of any sign that it could identify what it is. So a reality that lacks any definite form, he says, a reality without any single identity. So what is being dissolved here, I think, is not just the idea of some divine creator, although that's also one thing, but also the idea of a stable cause. And with it, the idea of a stable identity that persists throughout the process of becoming. So each hollow produces its sound through its particular shape, and that shape is what it is because of the relational and material conditions that formed it. So nothing stands free of its constitutive dependency. And dependence, as the passage implies, goes all the way down. So why does this matter for estimation? Because estimation, as the assignment of worth or xian to a person, an action, an achievement requires exactly what this passage dissolves, which is a stable subject. So a stable subject whose qualities can be identified, assessed, and ranked is what's being dissolved here. And if what a person is, right, is always already shaped by conditions that precede and exceed them, by fate, then conditions that are themselves transforming, right? Then the esteemable qualities, the accessible or measurable qualities we think we are tracking or measuring are themselves transforming. They are not stable properties of the person. So these are emergent features. So whether one is morally cultivated or not are emergent features of a particular intersection of dependencies. And the hollow doesn't dissolve or does not have a sound. It produces that sound in that configuration at that moment through those relations. So for Zhuangzi, if you attribute the sound to the hollow alone, then you may have already misread the situation. So in chapter 17 as well, he talks about how in the days of Yao and Shun, no one in the world was a failure, but this was not thanks to their wisdom. And here, what he does, so this passage does not say, not necessarily that Yao and Shun were aided, not necessarily that Yao and Shun were aided by favorable circumstance and therefore, they have their individual virtue rose or were like more aided or more helped. But rather it's something I think a bit more radical than that, in that he's not even leaving individual virtue intact. So it's the times that made it so. And wisdom, something willed and acquired, right? Something that an individual agent does out of their action and agency, drops out of the causal picture. So something else drops here as well. And this is the evaluative framework that makes success and failure meaningful categories in the first place are also dispensed with. And this is because success, I think, for the text is not a neutral fact, but a judgment which presupposes a purpose, a standard, a system of valuation of that standard over alternative standards. And each of these are already shaped by Shi, or the times. The configuration of the moment that determine which purposes are legible, which standards are operative, which achievements are visible as achievements at all. And to say that Yao and Shun succeeded is already to have accepted an evaluative framework that is itself a product of the times that made them. The judgment and the judged are caught in the same temporal configuration. So we can think of Ming as the structural dimension that Shi presupposes. So fate governs what is most constitutive and unchosen, that is, a lifespan, death, and basic condition of one's existence, while the times govern the social political configuration of the moment, the particular arrangement of circumstances that determines whether a person's qualities find purchase in the world. And these two are closely related, analogous, and together they establish something important, that there's no point in the causal chain at which a person stands free or is beyond or above the constitutive conditions and temporal configurations, which makes them, self-authoring or authoring outcomes through virtue alone. And what we like to claim often as individual effort or worth, or in chapter 2, when he says, when we shoot forth like an arrow from a bowstring, is actually something that is an emergent property of fate and the times. And neither of these things are things that the individual can fully control or choose. So the passage ends, this passage ends with a very insightful line where he says that, or the Zhuangzi text, that to know success depends on fate and failure on the times, to face great calamities without fear. That is the courage of the sage. And again, this is often read along the lines of psychological freedom, a kind of mental consolation. But I think that misses the big picture because I don't think that it's consoling us. I don't think that it's telling us to feel better about our failures by blaming the times. I think it's identifying a specific kind of enlightened, state which the sage has achieved. To know that the categories of success and failure are but products of the fate and the times, not stable measurements of individual worth. So we can't measure individuals and how worthy they are based on their individual effort because of the concepts of fate and the times. And I think that this is talked about greatly, actually. This is probably a controversial chapter. So in a controversial chapter of the Zhuangzi, we find in the text that goes, so this is the Robert Shi chapter. He says that a small thief gets arrested, a great thief gets to be feudal lord. So it's a controversial chapter, but I think that the entire chapter, and I make the argument for that in the paper that I published, but I think that this chapter is a systematic critique of inequality and hierarchy. That's a different topic for another time, but what I mean to point out here is how this chapter, and especially in this passage, tells us that success is really something that's socially constructed, not ontologically given. So removed from their social context, both a small thief and a great thief is actually the same. But what makes one a criminal and the other a feudal lord is not difference in moral character, but a difference in configuration of circumstances that render their action a success or failure. The category of quote-unquote feudal lord simply really tracks a successful crystallization of one configuration of power at one historical moment, which then presents itself as a stable reflection of moral worth. And what we can see here is that this crystallization is self-reinforcing. So as apologists like David Graeber and philosophers like Antonio Gramsci talk about this as well, but the configuration is self-reinforcing because once there's a hierarchy, once hierarchy has been produced, right, that hierarchy actually generates its own evaluative vocabulary, its own account of what counts as worthy, its own account of what counts as esteemable, or what counts as success and who counts as worthy. So the naming of worth thus reproduces the conditions that generate it instead of describing some pre-existing and blank slate of moral reality. Now, what does this leave us with? And I don't want to end with a tidy conclusion because I think that the passages resist such tidy conclusion. But what I want to say is that what these together establish is the idea that stable estimation or the assignment of reliable measurements of worth to persons and actions presupposes exactly what the Zhuangzi shows to be unavailable. That is a stable causal subject, a neutral evaluative framework, a moment of judgment that stands outside the temporal and structural conditions it is trying to assess. And none of these, I think, are, according to Zhuangzi, available. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine Tan, for your presentation. And now I would ask Professor Zhang to provide comments and questions. Professor Zhang, you have roughly 7 minutes.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate her presentation because he mentioned that we cannot judge Yao and Shun's success merely as their achievement, but we have to accept the fact that the Shi and the Ming produce their success probably. But in Zhuangzi, I think there are also some phrases, there are also some passages mention Yao and Shun, but totally in a different context. For example, 庄子 says, 以受命于地为松柏独也正，受命于天为尧舜独也正，在万物之首. So he mentioned Yao and Shun as 为尧舜独也正. So when he touched the topic about Zheng, I think he mainly talk about this concept in a moral dimension, or the self-cultivation dimension. So, as a person or as for Zhuangzi who just pursue the self-cultivation in order to be a Taoist sage, he emphasized so much about the self-cultivation, and instead of emphasizing or focusing on the failure or success or the related time and the mean, in the general sense. So I think the self-cultivation is always his primary focus, especially when he mentions Yao and Shun, the Confucian sage. But in Zhuangzi's context, I think he's also extols the virtuosity of these two persons, not diminish them. So I think so I wonder how you understand the efforts that we should make in order to be a Taoist sage. Because you mentioned the Shi and Ming is very important, and sometimes everything is produced, or the success or the achievements is actually produced by the time, by the Shi and the Ming. So what do you think the meaning of self-efforts? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. That's a really good point. So what does Zhuangzi, to me, what Zhuangzi means when he says that Yao and Shun are Zheng, right, is that there are definitely, it doesn't mean that, I don't mean to say that just because you cannot evaluate people, it doesn't mean that we cannot be dumb. We can, but there needs to be a differentiation between our, Jenny has called it the first order and second order, but I call it the normativity versus meta-normativity. So we can accept that there are systems in place that maybe even we need inequality, right? But doesn't mean that there are meta-normative or there are ultimate metaphysical justifications for that. That we need to be open to the fact that these will change over time, that the system, that the moralities and systems that we have right now will change, will definitely change over time, that they're not fixed. So I think that Yao and Shun definitely were dumb for their time, but and this is also the, I guess, the lesson with the wheelwright passage where he says, oh, those texts from the past are just like the dregs and dusts of sages, where normative moral evaluations can work and will work during the time that they're in, but they're not foundational or metaphysically fixed. They will change over time. Um, that's that's what I think. So I
Oh,
hope, yeah.
thank you very much. Um, so what's the role of self efforts? Do we still have to make efforts to pursue our dreams, or in order to be a sage or something that we admire?
Yeah, I think that that
Stumble.
comes down to our interpretation of Ziran, right? Because
Uh,
obviously there's a long tradition in not just in Zhuangzi of putting in effort to be Ziran. And in Buddhism as well, you need to put in effort to be somewhat Ziran, to be Wu as well. So I think that there is definitely room for individual effort, but it depends on how we interpret Ziran and towards what that individual effort is going to be for, right?
so you think 自然 is the ideal of the Taoist sage, and we try to make our efforts to be a sage that is aligned with 自然.
Yeah, yeah.
So okay, thank you. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
your understanding.
Okay, Professor Zhang, thank you for your discussion.
Thank you.
And now I would ask Professor Hung to provide us with her comments and questions.
Thank
Professor
you,
Hung,
Professor Tan, for your wonderful presentation. It's very interesting to talk about Xu and Ming, and also the framework of Zhuangzi via the piping of heaven and equanimity. So I have a question about your illustration of this differentiation between small and great thieves. So you mentioned that this story illustrates inequality and hierarchy. And so could you talk a little bit more about what the story indicates and why is it related to inequality and hierarchy? What are the thieves representing in the story?
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, so that passage was in the Robberture chapter, right? So if we'll remember Confucius, he goes to Robberture and says, oh, you should change your ways, stop being a menace to society, and because you're so cool, basically, you have all these you're very smart and you're very handsome. We could make you a feudal lord instead of this gangster that you are right now. So I think that a lot of people read that as controversial because they think that or doesn't know what to do with the chapter because the robber is objectively a really bad person, right? And but I think that if we look at it in a literary way, if we read it in a more literary sense, what's being done here is that the robber is being used as a character of being the worst possible character, and then Confucius is like the best possible character. And then you put them side by side, but then they don't have any difference, is what the Zhuangzi is trying to bring out. So in the same way, he's also trying to say, or the Zhuangzi is also trying to say that the great thief and the small thief, they don't have much difference except that one deals with like material things, the same way as the robber, he deals with stealing material things. But a great thief steals names and rankings and manipulates these in order to give give himself a good name. And I think that that kind of a posteriori justification of like justifying things after the fact is says a lot about how we measure values and estimation, how we value who's a good person and who's a bad person. It's usually done after the fact. And in a way, showing that or bringing that out is, I think, a critique on inequality. That inequality is often done after the fact, that it's not something that we can measure and rank as an ontological given. It's because of the power dynamics that we then actually look at it from after the fact and say, oh, that is a good person, that is a bad person, or that person deserves more, that person deserves less. So that's what I meant.
I see. I now understand more on how you how you interpret the stories, which is a very interesting interpretation according to my understanding. And so I have a more kind of ultimate question regarding your framework. Are you going to say that so there is no such thing as a neutral evaluative framework? And so if it is so, what about the Tao's perspective? Is there does there exist an ultimate perspective from the Tao? Um, which is kind
Um,
of neutral and evaluative, or there's no such thing, and everything is like from your own perspective, which is narrow, which is which is just representing your own view or from your own a perspective. What do you think?
yeah, I do think that that's a very good question to push, because I do think that now you're gonna see all my cards because I am actually more, I guess this is where I am more radical than most Chuangzi interpreters, in that I do think that Chuangzi is an absolute relativist in the same way that Brooke Ziporin has termed him as absolute relativist, in that there are frameworks, but all these frameworks, I think, are always changing, and there's no one absolute framework except the fact that all frameworks are always changing. So yeah, that is you got me.
Yeah, I can see your picture. It's like very much relativist position. And I guess you may say there is a huge difference between the Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi, because I guess you may say the Dao De Jing proposes the absolute Tao, right, as something that is more like over and above all these relativist perspectives. But I'm not sure what you think. Do you want to mention more about the differences between the Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi?
No, you're right. I do think that there's a difference between the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, and that you're right that for the Tao Te Ching, Tao is more this ultimate or meta-normative kind of final principle, right? Whereas in the Zhuangzi, I don't think that the Tao has that role. So it's just, I think the highest principle is probably, I would say, Ziran, and then Ziran is still, what even is that, right? Like it's just very constantly changing and not fixed.
I see. So I get your whole picture. I understand it, and I very much appreciate that idea. I like it. It's, I think, a very cogent interpretation of the 起物论, which is what you've just mentioned, basically. So thank you so much. I don't have other questions to ask.
Okay. Thank you to our speakers for this very intriguing discussion. And now we will open the floor for questions from the public. So in case there are questions from the audience, feel free to ask them now. Or also if the speakers themselves have any questions for each other, yeah, you can also post them right now. So if there's anything, any comments or questions about the presentations that have been left unsaid, yeah.
Hi. I have a question about Prof. Tan and Prof. Zhang's discussion about the Zheng. I'm wondering whether there is for Yao Shun. I'm wondering whether like for themselves and at their own time, could we say that they're doing the right things, or they're Zheng for themselves, or they're Zheng at their times? And in this case, Zhuangzi provides some principles or some understandings of what is right to do for a specific person in a specific time. In this case, that he like kind of also offers a normative argument. Could I say that? Thank you.
Should I answer for the question first?
Up
Okay.
to you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I think, yeah, yeah. Actually, I wrote a paper related on the concept of Zheng in Zhuangzi's philosophy, and I think obviously he didn't elaborate on the concept of Zheng in a very apparent and obvious manner, but he does think that there is normative rules or values, although he didn't mention it very clearly. For example, in 人间世, as I comments in Professor Jenny's lecture, I think Zhuangzi think there are some normative principles that we should hold in order to persuade an evil ruler to behave himself. So that is a very obvious case that proves that that a Zheng should be recognized and should be held. So I think that is a moral statement, but that usually applies to Confucian thoughts. But I think that is not very obvious in Zhuangzi's philosophy, but it also exists in Zhuangzi's thought. With respect to the conceptual Zheng, it relates to the moral principles, and I think he cares about it, but he didn't speak it very explicitly. That is,
Thank you.
yeah. I actually I wrote a paper exactly on this concept, published in the journal Dao. So if you are interested, I think maybe that will be helpful. And for now, I can just speak a little bit and make a very brief comments about your question. But overall, I think Zheng is very important. But in the Daoist sense or in Zhuangzi's sense, he really think that there is a principle value that we should hold, which could be named as Zheng. And this kind of moral principle is not explicitly expressed, but it exists in Zhuangzi's philosophy. So I think, as Jenny said, Confucianism and Daoism actually merge in some sense, and there are some consensus between them, but they express the same idea in different forms and in different manners. But actually, they agree with each other ultimately. So that is my opinion. And actually, yes, that is my basic comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I probably have a somewhat different view from Rongkun, because I do think that there are I don't think that there are any like fixed principles at all, or any kind of principles that Zhuangzi tells us to kind of adopt. In that it's always about, I think when I think about moral cultivation in the Zhuangzi, I think about the concept of ing, or responsiveness. That's where I would put the moral cultivation of Zhuangzi. And in that sense, it's always about adapting and responding to the specific situation, and that's always changing. There's no situation that is the exact same as another situation. It's like when he says that, when you look at a mirror, or that's taken into Buddhist studies as well, right? Where you look in the mirror and then next second it's a different person. And I think that situations are like that for Zhuangzi. So it's always changing, and there's no specific thing that you can lean on in order to be responsive. And in a way, it's even more difficult because, or it's more demanding, because you have to constantly listen to your surroundings and actually respond in a way that is compassionate and caring, if it's real responding, right? So I think that's what I think, yeah.
Oh, I just want to add some words. I actually agree with her. I actually agree with your opinion. In a very, there's no fixed moral standard or principle that we should stick to or hold. But in each changing specific circumstance, there is something that we can recognize as right or wrong. In every changing specific circumstance, we still can identify something that can be called right or 正. So we should hold on to them, hold on to this principle. And I think it is grounded in our self-cultivation, which is emptiness and stillness. So when we keep still, when our heart is empty and still, the standard can naturally emerge. The principle or the moral principle can naturally emerge in order for us to know what is right and what is wrong, and the standard that distinguish right and wrong is firmly grounded in our self-cultivation, which is emptiness and stillness. And I think Professor Fang Wanquan in Taiwan have done some research on 无为以定是非. So if non-action can actually determine what is right and what is wrong. So there is some moral standard about right and wrong, but the premise is that we should cultivate ourselves well and we should keep stillness and empty, and in order to make the right standard naturally emerge. So I think a lot of topics are really interconnected. So I really appreciate your idea and I agree with them. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Tan and Prof. Zhang. I would like to follow up a little bit about we were talking about when we should always be responding to the situations, and there might be a right thing to do in a specific situation. That in this case, could we say that Yao is always like he could always do the right thing, being responsive and at his time, or in any cases that he's facing up to, then we could call him an ideal person from the Zhuangzi perspective, and then he could get the Zheng. Does that make sense?
I think in theory it is. It is the case. Yeah, although Yao and Shun is a Confucian sage, I think it does not contradict with Zhuangzi's ideal or his ideal image. So I always agree with Professor Lai Xisan in Taiwan, his argument about the Taoist inner sageliness and afterward kingliness. Taoist inner sageliness and afterward kingliness. I think specifically it can refer to the Confucian figures or Confucian sages like Yao and Shun. So that is also the evidence that why we can interpret Zhuangzi's philosophy as 庄子是的内圣外王. So that is the evidence because he does mention the Confucian figures like Yao and Shun, right? And say they are 正. They have the virtue of 正.
Thank you, Prof. Zhang, and thank you again, Prof. Tan. The answer is very inspiring.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's just wait if there are other questions coming up. Okay, so if there are no questions from the public, from the audience, then I would say let's finish the discussion here. Thank you again very much to our speakers. And I wish everyone a wonderful day and hope to see you again.